Germany had enjoyed overwhelming success in the early years of World War II, with their jackboots walking over entire armies sometimes in a matter of days. An example being the 5 days it took to defeat the entire Belgian army. But in 1944, they were in widespread retreat. All of the so-called Lebensraum, or living space that they had fought so hard to gain, was now being returned in vast swathes. Uncle Joe's armies had regrouped and were unleashing their revenge in numbers from the east, whilst Allied armies were advancing from the west, and armadas of aeroplanes were continuing to flatten everything in between. It was clear now, Germany had bitten off more than it could chew, and it was beginning to pay the price. The German blitzkrieg was coming to an end. With any conflict comes casualties, man or machine. Germany had already simplified the manufacture of a lot of its machinery, be that because of a lack of raw materials like rubber, or simply to cut down cost or overall time it took to make, meaning they could be deployed faster. But there was one variable Hitler couldn't manufacture: manpower. The highly trained, athletic and motivated soldiers of the early years that helped carve his success were rapidly disappearing in their thousands on all fronts. Sure, the ranks could be bolstered with foreign volunteers or conscripts, of which there were approximately 1 million over the course of the war from many different countries. But not only were they generally not as well trained, but their motivation to save Germany on the brink of defeat was lacking and would generally see them surrender at the first opportunity, either because they were forced to be there or because their choice to be there was not specifically to help Germany itself. Entire German units would simply cease to exist. In areas they were employing Soviet tactics of executing deserters in an attempt to hold the lines, usually very openly on purpose. Hitler was declaring areas fortresses or Festungs, meaning no retreat was permitted. They must fight to the last man in a hope to delay advances. One famous example, despite being a small one in Eastern Front standards, was Ternopil in Ukraine. No less than 3 German generals were sent to the town in succession to organise its defence, all coming to the same conclusion: evacuate immediately. Not only was the German garrison poorly equipped, the town had no natural or man-made defences, a situation that no military tactician would be foolish enough to entertain. But Hitler's orders were final. Please listen to the following numbers, as they are, for want of a better word, horrific. Out of the 4,600 men in Festung Ternopil, only 55 men were lucky enough to escape unscathed. Be this from fatality, injury, or something possibly a lot worse, capture by Soviet forces, an attrition rate of 99%. Hitler was promoting the officers in command of these areas to field marshals, because no German field marshal had ever been captured. This was in a hope that they would fight to the bitter end and not allow retreat. This would not always work, as we know, with famous surrenders like that of Field Marshal Paulus in Stalingrad. This was not to say that the once glorious German Wehrmacht had disappeared. In areas it was still a formidable opponent, putting up a strong defence and at times still winning fights. But they were now desperate for men to delay the crushing Allied advance, and not only men, boys and old men. And so in September 1944, the Volkssturm was born. The idea of General Heinz Guderian, the chief of the General Staff. It was meant to be a sort of last line of defence militia, but would be much more extensively used than first intended. Germany was not the only country in World War II to employ essentially a civilian army. Britain was another example, albeit a more organised and equipped force than their German counterparts. But then again, time was on their side, and also they could benefit from a nice little defensive barrier, the ocean. Ultimate command of the Volkssturm was given to Heinrich Himmler, the father of the SS. The Volkssturm idea was given inspiration from the Prussian Landsturm that fought against Napoleon as a guerrilla force at the beginning of the 19th century, and it would go hand in hand with the total war ideology of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' speech in 1943. Optimistically, it would announce plans for 6 million members, possibly yet more propaganda, a number it would never come close to attaining. It was sold to the German public as the will to resist at all costs and to relight the flame of patriotism and possibly victory in the face of by now widespread defeatism, after repeated losses and indiscriminate bombings of German towns and cities. In reality, it was German hierarchies showing their own fanaticism, in the face of no less than 4 superpowers knocking at their door, they were still prepared to sacrifice more and more in the hope that one day they may prevail, whether they believed it or not. The order was given, and men between the ages of 16 and 60 who were not already in service would be given any weapon that was left and told to defend the fatherland at all costs. I'll go into their weaponry in another video as it's quite interesting and diverse. Their official uniform was but a black armband inscribed, "German People's Storm Armed Forces." There was an attempt to issue as much official military uniform as possible, but this was often old designs or even a mixture of anything still available. In most instances, they were told to wear anything they had. This could be anything from work overalls to suits. Entire units of the Hitler Youth would be mobilised and told to wear what they had already been issued. Some would even wear World War I uniforms or parts thereof. There are even reports of captured or repurposed helmets being worn. Little to no equipment was left, so anything they needed they were to bring themselves, down to blankets or cutlery. By this time, the young boys would be indoctrinated by Nazi ideology and possessed a lack of self-preservation inherent in young people, making them perfect candidates. And the old men may well have served in World War I, so have a knowledge of warfare. And due to the lack of instructors, these veterans often found themselves becoming the instructors. Not forgetting that Germany, unlike many countries in Europe, had national service, so many indeed already had a basic knowledge of soldiering. Their training was brief and at times non-existent. Many of its members found themselves literally learning on the job. The combination of their poor training and almost non-existent entrance requirements would contribute to it quickly being realised that the Volkssturm units were rapidly destroyed if deployed alone. From this point onwards, they would be used much like today's reserve armies and deployed alongside their regular counterparts where possible, to either bolster numbers or replace battlefield casualties. At a bare minimum, their commanders tended to be part of the regulars in some capacity. There were some areas that these civilian soldiers did have an impact, however, mainly on the Eastern Front against Russian forces, probably because they did not want to surrender or had heard about the brutal reprisals being dished out by the Soviets and wanted to deny them the chance. The other was in towns and cities where their simple man-portable anti-tank weapons could be brought to bear with ease. As the war dragged on and the situation worsened, the Volkssturm entry requirements would loosen. Those previously deemed unfit for service, underage, overage, and either those recovering from injuries or classed as invalids would now be pushed onto the front line. A role the Volkssturm was not originally intended. There is evidence that some members even had missing limbs. Towards the very end, women and girls as young as 14 would be included and trained on the use of small arms. Surprisingly, a lot took this up after hearing about the acts carried out by Soviet troops. A lot of the Volkssturm simply surrendered, realising their futility. But there were a lot of fanatical and at times suicidal individuals, two things that proved rife in the Nazi regime. This was helped by years of Nazi propaganda and indoctrination. One village, defended by Volkssturm, declared itself a fortress in April 1945. The decision would see the area razed to the ground by artillery and firebombs, and it resulted in many casualties, including civilians. This event would further fuel capitulation of its members. It was becoming clear to the German people that this was the end. Hitler's dreams of a 1,000-year Reich was now little more than a race to see who would finish them first, the much-feared East or the West.